The second part of Chapter 12 is going to talk about the two most popular theories to explain how we act once we're actually in a relationship. So the first theory is called attachment theory. This is definitely the most popular theory in all of social psychology. It's not my favorite theory, but it's the most popular. So I'll explain it, and then I'll hopefully remember to tell you why it's not my favorite. So attachment theory says that your first relationship in life, the one that you have when you're a baby, your very first relationship, is going to become a model or a template for all of your future relationships. So the attachment that you form with your primary caregiver, that's basically usually your mother, sometimes your father, will form a basis for you that will influence all of the rest of your relationships. So if that first relationship is positive and healthy, then your future relationships will also be positive and healthy. If that first initial relationship is unhealthy, if it has insecurity in it, then your future relationships will also have insecurity. So that becomes kind of like your personality within a relationship. And we call that your attachment style. So the person who came up with attachment theory was a man named John Bowlby, and he had a colleague who was basically like his student. Her name was Mary Ainsworth, and they tested this with infants in a laboratory procedure called the strange situation. The strange situation was that a mother, this was done in the 50s and 60s, so it was most mothers that we're talking about here as primary caregivers. Times have changed. There are now certainly lots of different kinds of families, fathers who are primary caregivers, but in the 50s and 60s, it was mostly mothers. So they would have a mother come in with an infant, younger than the age of 2 usually, and this strange situation wasn't strange like weird, it was just strange meaning new or novel. So the mother and the infant would come into the lab, and there would be a room set up and have a lot of toys, and the mother and the infant would interact for a few minutes, and then the mother would leave. There was an experimenter in the room, so the baby wasn't by itself. But what they were measuring was how would the baby react when the mother left? Did the baby seem really, really upset? Did it cry? Did it cling to the mother? Or was the baby okay with the mother leaving, trusting that she would eventually come back? So they measured how did the infant respond when the mom left, and then after a couple of minutes, the mom returned, and again they measured how did the baby respond to her return. Did the baby seem happy and reach out to her? Did the baby kind of reject her and pretend like, I don't care that you're back, right? So how is the baby responding to the coming and going of the mother? What they found through their testing in the strange situation was what they called 3 attachment styles that are on the table here. So the most common that they found in about 2/3 of the babies was what they called a secure attachment. This is the healthy, happy attachment. So this is when the parents consistently were good toward the baby, and this led to a moderate amount of anxiety when the parent left. The baby was initially upset, but adjusted and started to play with toys, and we can assume that the baby thought, well, she's coming back, everything will be okay. Of course, we can't actually ask the baby, but that's what Bowlby and Ainsworth decided. So the baby did explore the same strange situation room when the mom left. The baby seemed to have a high amount of self-esteem, and when we follow secure people into adulthood, what we see in their adult romantic relationships is that they have pretty healthy, trusting relationships as adults. So as an example of that, they don't seem to be particularly jealous of their partner or possessive of their partner because they trust that their partner is going to be there for them and will come back to them basically if you have to leave temporarily for, you're going out with friends or you're going on a work trip or something like that. It's not particularly upsetting because you trust your partner, just like you trusted that your mother would come back. There were 2 other forms of attachment style that they found. One was called anxious ambivalent. So this was the result of inconsistent parents, and the babies basically weren't really sure whether they had their mother's love. So they were highly anxious when their mother would leave. They didn't explore the room because they were so upset. They kind of showed this attachment insecurity. They were sort of obsessed with his mom coming back. They had low self-esteem. And if you follow these people into adulthood, These are the people who tend to be really kind of insecure, clingy, and jealous as romantic partners because they don't really have trust in their partner. The third attachment style is what they called avoidant fearful. So these were babies who had consistently bad parents, and they had basically built up a defense mechanism or kind of a psychological wall where they had kind of unattached from their parents. They were like, well, you're kind of a jerk to me, or you're not even around, so I've learned not to rely on you, so I don't even really care that you leave because I was expecting you to leave anyway. So they don't show anxiety when the mother leaves because I knew you were going to leave. They do explore the strange situation room because they've built up that kind of independence. But what we find is that they still are kind of haunted by a low self-esteem. And as adults, they have trouble forming relationships and maintaining relationships with other people because they don't really trust other people. So they kind of just stay back, and they don't really show any vulnerability to other people because they've built up this emotional wall. Now, 20 years later, in the 80s and 90s, a modification of attachment theory was developed in which there were 4 styles suggested for attachment. So this model, which was by 2 researchers named Bartholomew and Horowitz, suggested we can really kind of plot attachment style based on 2 major variables. The first variable here you can see is your view of yourself. So this is basically your self-esteem. You have high self-esteem, which is a positive view of self, or low self-esteem, which is a negative view of self. And then your view of other people. Do you trust other people? Do you think that they'll be there when you need them? If so, that's positive. If you don't trust other people and you don't rely on them, then that's a negative view of others. So depending on where you fall in these 2 variables, we have 4 different possible outcomes. Secure is still called secure. So that's the best possible scenario where I have high self-esteem, I trust other people. This leads to happy, healthy relationships. If I have low self-esteem, but I really want other people to like me, that leads to what they call preoccupied. This is the really clingy, jealous personality style in relationships because I have low self-esteem, but I want your love. So I'm kind of constantly doing stuff to prove my love. I'm trying to get you to commit really early. I'm really jealous. I want to be around you all the time. I don't trust that we should have independence. Another combination is if I have a positive self-esteem, I think I'm fantastic, but I don't really like or trust other people. They call that dismissing. So this is kind of arrogant people in relationships. They have a lot of like one-night stands, or they manipulate other people because they never feel like the other person is good enough for them. They have this elevated narcissistic view of themselves. And then the fourth combination is what we call fearful in this model, which is I don't like myself. I don't like other people. So again, I kind of don't really form attachments with anyone. I sort of stay by myself because I don't think anyone's going to like me. I don't really like anybody else. So I don't even make the effort. So attachment theory, like I said, is a popular idea. A lot of psychologists appreciate the idea that our early relationships influence our later relationships. And I certainly think that's true. One of the reasons that I don't like attachment theory is because it doesn't give us any kind of choice or responsibility for how we act in relationships. It's basically saying that it's your destiny to be a certain way because of how you were raised as a child. And I think that we have more responsibility and more control over how we act in relationships. I think we need to take that independence and responsibility for how we act. We can trust the partner, we cannot trust the partner, but I think that we have more involvement in that as adults. So I prefer the second theory, which is called interdependence theory. Interdependence theory starts with the idea that when you're single, you are an independent entity. You can do whatever you want, pretty much. It doesn't really affect other people, except for maybe your friends and your family, right? But you're not in a relationship. Once you form a relationship with someone else, you are now interdependent instead of independent. So what that means is that your actions, your decisions affect your partner and vice versa. This can be on a small level, like if you come home in a bad mood, that affects your partner. It can be big things, like if you get a promotion at work, but it means you have to move to another country, that affects your partner, right? So once you're in a relationship, you are now interdependent. It's not the same as codependent, where you're kind of needy, but it just means that you affect each other. So you're a unit now. The original theory was developed trying to understand how do we decide whether to commit to a given partner. So how do you decide this is the one for me? I'm gonna move in with this person or marry this person or at least be monogamous with this person. Whatever you decide, like this is the one relationship and I'm gonna be with this one person. How do you make that decision? So that decision is commitment. And interdependence theory says there are two factors or variables that predict commitment. The first is your satisfaction. In interdependence theory, the way that you decide if you're satisfied is a very kind of logical, thought out process. Step one is you think about what are the current outcomes of my relationship. Your current outcomes is basically just kind of the ratio of positive to negative interactions that you have because of this relationship. So does my partner say loving and supportive things to me, or does my partner say like negative, kind of abusive, mean things to me, right? What's the ratio? So the ratio of whatever is going on right now is your current outcomes. You then compare that to what they call your CL, or your comparison level, which is your abstract idea of the ratio of a typical relationship. So if you think, okay, my ratio right now is 5 to 1. 5 good things for every 1 bad thing. Of course, we fight sometimes, but it's a 5 to 1 ratio. Mostly we have positive interactions. So you think my current outcomes is a 5 to 1 ratio, and you think the average relationship should be better than that. It should be 10 to 1. If that's what you think, then you will be dissatisfied because you don't like your current ratio, and you will be less likely to be committed. If you think 5 to 1 is pretty good, that's probably about average, then you might be more likely to commit to that partner. So more or less, if your current outcomes are better than your comparison level, if you think this ratio is pretty good, you'll be satisfied and you'll commit. If you think that your current outcomes, even if they're a positive ratio, if they're not good enough, then you might be dissatisfied. You might think, I can do better, basically. So satisfaction is the first variable. The second variable is, well, if you weren't with this person, what are your alternatives, right? Are there other people you could date? Would you rather just be single for a while? That's a viable alternative. So before you decide to commit to this one given person, you think, well, what are my other options, basically? And your CL alt in this theory stands for your comparison level for alternatives. So you basically, again, do this kind of balance where you say, okay, here's my current outcomes. Is my next best alternative worse or better than what I have right now? If my alternative is better, if I feel like I could be dating somebody else, or I'd rather just be single for a while, then I'm not going to be able to commit, right? Because I have a good alternative. If I think this is the best relationship that I could be in, I'm really happy, I don't think I could do better, then your alternatives are lower and you're more likely to commit. So satisfaction is positively correlated with commitment, and alternatives are negatively correlated with commitment, because the more alternatives you have, or the better alternatives you have, the lower your commitment is going to be. In the 1980s, a woman named Carol Rusbolt added to interdependence theory. She thought that we needed a third variable. So Rusbolt said, I can think of a lot of relationships where satisfaction is pretty low, they don't seem very happy, and probably they have pretty good alternatives, but they still are together. So how can we explain that? The third variable that she added is what's called investments. Investments are the time and effort and sacrifices and stuff that you have that's kind of tying you to this relationship. So we know a lot of people say, I waited to divorce my wife or my husband until after the kids were out of the house, right? So the investment of children and raising a family was keeping them in the relationship. Maybe you have pooled all of your economic resources and you can't afford to move out on your own because you've invested financially into this relationship and you've bought a house together and you have all your furniture together, right? Maybe you've spent 20 years with this person and that investment of time is keeping you in the relationship because you feel like, I don't want to start over, basically. So she says, if you've put all of this effort or resources into the relationship, that might tie you and commit you, even if your satisfaction isn't great or you have decent alternatives. The investments might basically keep you in the relationship despite low satisfaction or high alternatives. So if you put all three of these together, you get what we call the investment model, because we add that third variable of investments. So again, we're trying to measure the outcome here is the stability of the relationship. Are two people going to stay together or not? We say that stability in a relationship is predicted by commitment, and that commitment is predicted by these three variables. So we know that satisfaction is positively correlated to commitment. The more satisfied you are, the more likely you are to stay. We know that alternatives are negatively correlated with commitment. If you have better alternatives, you're going to leave. And that investments are positively correlated to commitment. So if you've put in more time and effort and resources, you're more likely to stick around because you don't want to waste all of that effort. So altogether, these three things are called the investment model because they add to interdependence theory, which only had the first two variables. I like this model better because I think it shows more kind of adult maturity. It shows the real kinds of decisions that we make on a day-to-day level. But other people have criticized this model for saying it's a little bit too mathematical, it's a little bit too logical, and choices that we make when we're in love with someone aren't always necessarily logical. So you have two very different kinds of approaches here to how we act in romantic relationships, and you can choose which model you like better.